My name is Rebecca Martinez and I'm 28 years old. 3 weeks ago, I was standing in front of my childhood home holding an eviction notice that would change everything I thought I knew about family. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike, celebrated every birthday, and felt safest in the world was apparently no longer mine to call home. My mother Sandra had called that morning with the coldest voice I'd ever heard her use, informing me that they'd sold our family property to an investor, and I had exactly 30 days to pack my things and leave. What she didn't expect was for me to discover that this mysterious investor was actually a shell company they'd created themselves. But when I called the bank to verify the details, the truth I uncovered was even more devastating than I could have imagined. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready for a family drama that will absolutely blow your mind. Make sure to subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. And stick around until the end because the phone call I made to the bank revealed secrets that destroyed my family forever. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare all began. 6 months before that devastating phone call, I was living what I thought was a successful life in Seattle. I had a promising job at a tech startup, a long-term relationship with my college boyfriend Jake, and dreams of buying my own place by 30. But life has a way of crumbling when you least expect it. The startup folded overnight when our main investor pulled out, leaving me unemployed with a severance package that barely covered 2 months of rent. Jake, who I'd been with for 4 years and thought might propose soon, decided that my unemployment was the perfect time to confess he'd been seeing someone else for 6 months. Within 2 weeks, I lost my job, my relationship, and my confidence all at once. That's when I made the decision to come home to San Jose, California. My parents, Robert and Sandra Martinez, had always been my safety net. Dad worked as an insurance adjuster while Mom managed a small accounting firm, and they'd built a comfortable middle-class life in the 3-bedroom house they'd owned for 15 years. When I called them crying and explained my situation, they immediately offered their spare room and told me to take as long as I needed to get back on my feet. It felt like the universe was giving me a chance to restart, and I was grateful beyond words. The first month back home was exactly what I needed. Mom cooked my favorite meals and Dad would sit with me on the porch telling stories about his own career setbacks in his 20s. My older brother Marcus, who was 30 and worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company, seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being and offered to help update my resume. My younger sister Sophia, 25 and fresh out of grad school working at a marketing agency, even cleared her schedule to have sister bonding days with me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was surrounded by people who truly cared about me. But subtle changes began creeping in during my second month at home. Dad started making casual comments about the rising cost of groceries and utilities, always when I was within earshot. Mom began asking pointed questions about my job search timeline and whether I'd heard back from any of the companies I'd applied to. The conversations felt supportive on the surface, but there was an underlying tension that made me increasingly uncomfortable. By month 3, the passive-aggressive hints evolved into direct requests. Dad sat me down one evening and explained that while they loved having me home, they needed to start charging rent to help cover the additional expenses my presence was creating. He asked for $1,200 per month, which seemed reasonable for the Bay Area, so I agreed without argument. I was grateful to have a place to stay and understood that I was an adult who should contribute to household costs. But the financial demands didn't stop there. Mom began restricting my access to certain areas of the house, explaining that the formal living room and Dad's home office were off limits because they needed to maintain those spaces for their own use. I was no longer allowed to use the washing machine during peak hours and had to schedule my laundry around their preferences. These rules felt excessive, but I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I complied with every new restriction they imposed. The family dynamics shifted dramatically when Marcus started openly supporting our parents' increasingly harsh treatment of me. During family dinners, he would make comments about how I needed to step up and stop depending on others to solve my problems. I later discovered that Marcus had borrowed $50,000 from our parents 6 months earlier to invest in cryptocurrency, money that he'd lost entirely when the market crashed. His sudden enthusiasm for making me pay rent and follow strict household rules made perfect sense once I understood that my contributions were helping our parents recoup the money he'd lost through his reckless financial decisions. Sophia's attitude toward me changed just as dramatically. Where she'd once been warm and supportive, she became distant and cold. She stopped initiating our sister bonding activities and would barely make eye contact during family conversations. When I tried to talk to her privately about the tension I was feeling at home, she brushed off my concerns and told me I was being oversensitive and paranoid. Her dismissiveness hurt more than our parents' financial demands because I'd always counted on her as my closest ally in the family. The first major attack came at the end of my 4th month at home. Dad called a family meeting and announced that due to increased household expenses and market changes, my monthly rent would be raised to $2,000. This was nearly double what I'd been paying, and more than many apartments in the area cost. When I protested that the increase seemed excessive, Mom accused me of being ungrateful and entitled. Marcus jumped in to support them, arguing that I was getting a bargain compared to market rates and should be thankful they weren't charging me even more. The most crushing part of this confrontation was watching Sophia sit silently through the entire discussion. I kept waiting for her to defend me or at least acknowledge that the rent increase was unreasonable, but she never said a word. After our parents and Marcus left the room, I begged her to explain what was happening and why everyone suddenly seemed determined to make my life miserable. She looked me straight in the eye and said that maybe it was time for me to grow up and face reality. Her words hit me like a physical blow because I realized that somehow I'd lost not just my parents' unconditional support, but also my sister's love and loyalty. Despite feeling hurt and confused by their treatment, I agreed to pay the increased rent because I was terrified of being homeless. My job search was progressing slowly, and I didn't have enough savings to cover deposits and moving expenses for my own place. I felt trapped and vulnerable, exactly the way they wanted me to feel. But their demands for money were just the beginning of a much more sinister plan that would ultimately destroy everything I thought I knew about the people who were supposed to love me most. During my 5th month at home, curiosity and growing suspicion led me to do something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to our family's financial situation in ways that went beyond my own rent payments. My background in tech had given me strong analytical skills, and I began noticing discrepancies in my parents' behavior that didn't add up. They claimed to need my rent money for household expenses, yet Dad had recently purchased a new truck, and Mom was talking about renovating the kitchen. These weren't the financial choices of people who were struggling to make ends meet. My suspicions deepened when I accidentally saw a bank statement that Dad had left on the kitchen counter. The document showed a substantial deposit of $300,000 that had been made just 2 months before I moved back home. This amount was far more than my parents had ever had in their account during my entire childhood, and seeing it made me realize that their claims about needing my rent money were complete lies. I carefully photographed the statement with my phone before Dad returned and quickly put it away. That evening, I used my tech skills to dig deeper into our family's financial records. I accessed their online banking accounts using passwords I'd seen them enter over the years, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. The $300,000 deposit had come from a home equity line of credit taken against our house. They'd mortgaged our family home, which had been completely paid off for years, to access this massive amount of cash. But even more shocking was where that money had gone. The bank records showed multiple large transfers over several months. $50,000 had gone directly into Marcus's personal checking account, confirming my suspicion that they'd covered his cryptocurrency losses. Another $100,000 had been transferred to something called Martinez Family Holdings LLC, a company I'd never heard of before. The remaining money had been moved into various investment accounts and certificates of deposit, suggesting that my parents weren't financially struggling at all. They were actively building wealth while simultaneously claiming they needed my rent money to survive. Armed with this information, I confronted my father the next morning. I showed him the bank statement and demanded an explanation for why they were charging me rent when they clearly didn't need the money. Dad's response was to fly into a rage unlike anything I'd ever seen from him. He accused me of spying on the family and violating their privacy. When I pressed him about the home equity loan and where the money had gone, he claimed it was all for home improvements and retirement planning. Explanations that didn't match the transfer records I'd seen. Mom's reaction was even worse. When she came home from work and Dad told her about our confrontation, she screamed at me for over an hour about being a sneaky and manipulative daughter who was trying to destroy the family. She accused me of having criminal intentions and threatened to call the police if I ever accessed their financial information again. Her fury was so intense and irrational that I began to understand that my presence in their house had become a genuine threat to whatever plan they were executing. Marcus arrived during Mom's tirade and immediately sided with our parents. He got in my face and told me that if I didn't like living in their house under their rules, I should get the hell out. When I mentioned the $50,000 he'd received from them, he became physically threatening, stepping close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath, and telling me that I'd better watch my mouth or face serious consequences. For the first time in my life, I felt physically unsafe in my own family's presence. The second major attack came just 3 days later. Dad and Mom called me into the living room for another family meeting. But this time Marcus was absent and the atmosphere was completely different. They announced that they had made the difficult decision to sell our family home to an investor who had made them an offer they couldn't refuse. They told me that the sale would be final in 30 days, and that I would need to find alternative housing immediately, because the new owner wanted possession of an empty house. I was devastated by this news. Not only was I losing my childhood home, but they were giving me virtually no time to find affordable housing in one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country. When I asked about the details of this supposed sale, and whether I could speak with the buyer to negotiate a longer transition period, Mom told me that the transaction was none of my business, and that I needed to respect their decision as homeowners. What made this betrayal even more painful was their complete lack of empathy for my situation. They offered no financial assistance for moving expenses, no help with finding alternative housing, and no explanation of where I was supposed to go with less than a month's notice. When I broke down crying and begged them to reconsider, or at least give me more time, Dad told me coldly that I was 28 years old and needed to figure it out, like any other adult would. The cruelest part of their announcement was the way they framed it as a business decision that had nothing to do with their feelings about me personally. They claimed that this investor had approached them, out of the blue, with such an attractive offer that turning it down would be financially irresponsible. They insisted that if they could have given me more notice, they would have, but that the investor's timeline was non-negotiable, and they had to choose between my comfort and their financial future. Desperate for support, I went to Sophia's apartment that same evening to tell her what had happened, and ask if I could stay with her temporarily, while I figured out my next steps. Her response shattered what was left of my faith in our family bonds. She told me that she couldn't help me because she was trying to maintain neutrality in the situation and didn't want to get involved in whatever was happening between me and our parents. When I pressed her about whether she thought 30 days was reasonable notice for such a major life change, she avoided giving me a direct answer. But then Sophia revealed something that made me realize just how deep this betrayal went. She mentioned that our parents had promised her a $20,000 bonus if I moved out of the house before a certain deadline. She tried to frame it as a reward for supporting the family during a difficult transition. But it was obvious that my own sister had been financially incentivized to abandon me when I needed her most. The people I'd trusted most in the world had not only plotted against me, but had actively worked to isolate me from any source of support or assistance. As I drove back to the house that night, I felt completely defeated. I'd lost my job, my relationship, my home, and now my family's love and loyalty. I was facing homelessness in one of the most expensive cities in America with no financial resources, and no one to turn to for help. For the first time since moving back home, I seriously considered giving up entirely, and accepting that maybe I really was the burden and disappointment they seemed to believe I was. That night, as I lay awake in what might be my bed for only a few more weeks, something inside me shifted from despair to determination. I realized that if my family was willing to destroy my life for money, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. My tech background had taught me that information was power, and I decided to use every skill I possessed to uncover the truth about what they were really doing. The next morning, while my parents were at work, I began a systematic investigation of their digital footprint. I accessed Dad's email account using a password he'd been using for years, and what I found there made everything crystal clear. There were dozens of emails exchanged with a business attorney about forming Martinez Family Holdings LLC, and detailed discussions about real estate investment strategies. The mysterious investor who had supposedly approached them out of the blue was actually their own company, and the sale was nothing more than a shell game designed to transfer ownership while avoiding certain legal and tax obligations. But I needed professional help to understand the full scope of what they were doing, so I hired a private investigator named Jake Morrison with $2,000 from my dwindling savings account. Jake was a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases, and he agreed to help me trace the money trail and understand the legal implications of my parents' actions. What he discovered over the next week was far worse than I'd imagined. Jake's investigation revealed that Martinez Family Holdings LLC was indeed owned entirely by my parents, with Marcus listed as the company's treasurer and Sophia as its secretary. The plan was to sell our family home to this company for $850,000, nearly double what they'd paid for it 15 years earlier. But since they owned the company that was buying the house, they were essentially transferring the property to themselves while creating the appearance of a legitimate sale for tax and legal purposes. The most shocking part of Jake's findings was the profit distribution agreement he discovered. According to the company's internal documents, Marcus was set to receive 40% of the eventual profit when the house was resold to a genuine third party. Sophia would receive 10% for her role in the scheme. My parents would keep the remaining 50%, meaning that my brother and sister had been promised hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for helping to deceive and evict me from my own childhood home. Armed with this devastating information, I confronted my father one final time. I presented him with copies of the emails, the LLC formation documents, and the profit-sharing agreement. I told him that I knew exactly what they were doing and demanded that they either include me in the financial arrangement or give me sufficient time and money to find alternative housing. Dad's response revealed just how cold and calculating he'd become. He looked me straight in the eye and told me that I had never contributed anything meaningful to this family, and that I'd been nothing but an expense and a burden since childhood. He said that Marcus had earned his share by being successful in his career and supporting the family's goals, while Sophia had proven her loyalty by choosing their interests over mine. According to Dad, I deserved nothing because I'd failed to launch as an adult and had come crawling back home, expecting to be supported indefinitely. His words were designed to destroy what was left of my self-esteem, but instead they gave me clarity about who my parents really were. I realized that their love had always been conditional on my usefulness to them, and that they'd never seen me as a person deserving of respect and consideration. This wasn't a family going through a difficult time. This was a group of people who decided that my well-being was expendable in pursuit of their financial goals. The third major attack came the next day when I returned from a job interview to find that the locks on our house had been changed. My belongings had been thrown onto the front lawn, including my laptop, my clothes, and several sentimental items from my childhood that couldn't be replaced. Marcus was standing in the yard with two of his friends, apparently hired as muscle to make sure I didn't try to force my way back into the house. When I demanded an explanation, he told me that I'd violated their trust by hiring an investigator and that I was no longer welcome on their property. I called the police, but they told me that since I wasn't on the lease and my parents owned the house, this was a civil matter rather than a criminal one. The officers suggested that I gather my belongings and find somewhere else to stay while I consulted with an attorney about my legal options. As I loaded my possessions into my car, I could see Mom watching from the upstairs window, but she never came outside to speak with me or offer any explanation for why they'd chosen to handle the situation so cruelly. For the first week after being locked out, I slept in my car in various parking lots around San Jose. I showered at a 24-hour gym and ate fast food because I couldn't afford restaurant meals or grocery shopping without a kitchen. The isolation and uncertainty were crushing my spirit in ways that unemployment and heartbreak never had. I began to understand why some people simply disappeared from their families' lives without explanation. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you become so toxic that survival requires cutting all ties. My salvation came in the form of Maria Gonzalez, our 65-year-old neighbor, who had watched my family for over a decade. Maria approached me while I was parked outside our old house, trying to work up the courage to ring the doorbell and beg my parents for reconciliation. She told me that she'd witnessed my belongings being thrown onto the lawn and had seen Marcus's friends standing guard while I was locked out. She'd also overheard several heated phone conversations my parents had been having in their backyard, conversations that revealed details about their financial scheme. Maria offered me her guest room for as long as I needed it, refusing to accept any payment despite my insistence. More importantly, she provided me with something I hadn't realized I desperately needed: validation that my family's treatment of me was genuinely wrong. She told me that in her 40 years of living in America, she'd never seen parents treat a child so cruelly, and that whatever I was going through was not normal family conflict but genuine abuse. But Maria's most valuable gift was the security camera footage from her house. Her cameras had captured several weeks' worth of activity in front of our family home, including Marcus loading expensive items into his truck during the day while my parents were at work. The footage also showed my parents hosting what appeared to be celebration dinners on their patio, complete with champagne and multiple guests. Hardly the behavior of people who were struggling financially or upset about selling their beloved family home. With Maria's support and Jake Morrison's continued investigation, I began to see a path forward that didn't involve begging my family for mercy or accepting their narrative that I was a failure who deserved to be homeless. I started planning a counterattack that would expose their scheme and force them to face legal consequences for their fraud. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I might actually have a chance to fight back and win. With Maria's guest room as my base of operations and Jake Morrison's investigative findings in hand, I knew I needed professional legal help to navigate what was becoming a complex financial fraud case. I reached out to several attorneys, but most wanted retainer fees of $15,000 or more, money I simply didn't have after months of unemployment and the costs of hiring Jake. The few lawyers willing to work on contingency weren't convinced that my case was strong enough to guarantee the significant payout that would justify their investment of time and resources. My first potential ally came through an unexpected source. My Aunt Linda, Dad's older sister, had heard about the family conflict through mutual relatives and reached out to me via Facebook. She expressed concern about how I was being treated and offered to meet me for coffee to discuss the situation. During our conversation, she revealed that Dad had borrowed money from her several times over the years and had never fully repaid those loans. She suspected that his recent financial maneuvering was connected to his ongoing money problems, and she offered to help me find legal representation. Linda seemed genuinely sympathetic to my situation and angry about how her brother was treating me. She told me stories about Dad's pattern of selfish behavior that went back to their childhood, and she confirmed my suspicion that his current actions were consistent with a lifetime of putting his own interests above everyone else's well-being. For a brief moment, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this battle against my immediate family, but this hope was crushed just 2 weeks later, when Linda suddenly stopped returning my calls and began avoiding my messages. I later discovered through Jake's investigation that Dad had offered her $30,000 to stay out of family business and had promised to repay the money he'd borrowed from her over the years. Linda had chosen financial gain over family loyalty, just like Marcus and Sophia had done. I realized that my father's corruption was spreading through our extended family like a virus, turning everyone against me with promises of money and threats of financial retaliation. The fourth major attack came when my parents decided to escalate from emotional and financial warfare to legal intimidation. Dad filed a police report claiming that I'd been harassing the family and trespassing on their property despite being asked to stay away. He told officers that I'd been making threatening phone calls and had shown up at the house uninvited multiple times, accusations that were completely false, but impossible for me to disprove without evidence. When 2 police officers arrived at Maria's house to question me about these allegations, I felt genuine terror for the first time since this ordeal began. The possibility of being arrested and getting a criminal record would have destroyed any chance I had of rebuilding my career in tech, where background checks were standard and any legal issues could make me unemployable. The officers were professional and seemed skeptical of Dad's claims, but they still had to follow up on the report and warn me to avoid all contact with my family members. The situation became even more humiliating when Marcus decided to weaponize social media against me. He posted a live video on Facebook where he claimed to be protecting his family from his mentally unstable sister who had been stalking and threatening them since being asked to move out. The video showed him standing in front of our childhood home, describing me as someone who had always been jealous of other family members' success and who was now trying to destroy innocent people because of her own failures. Marcus's video went viral within our extended social circle, reaching hundreds of our mutual connections including former classmates, family friends, and distant relatives. The comments section filled with people expressing sympathy for my parents and shock at my alleged behavior. Several viewers shared their own stories about toxic family members and offered advice about getting restraining orders and changing security systems. Watching people I'd known my entire life discuss me as if I were a dangerous criminal was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For 24 hours after Marcus's video was posted, I seriously considered disappearing entirely. I researched moving to different states where I could start over with a new identity and no connection to my toxic family. The idea of becoming someone completely different in a place where no one knew my history felt like the only way to escape the nightmare my life had become. I even looked into changing my last name, so that future employers wouldn't be able to connect me to any negative publicity from this situation. My lowest moment came when I had to spend a night in my car because Maria's house was being fumigated, and I had nowhere else to go. As I sat in a 24-hour diner parking lot at 3 a.m, I called a suicide prevention hotline because the weight of isolation and hopelessness had become unbearable. The counselor I spoke with helped me realize that my family's treatment of me was emotional abuse designed to make me feel worthless and defeated, and that giving up would mean letting them win completely. But just when I was ready to surrender and accept defeat, I encountered the person who would change everything. Jessica Torres was a family law attorney who volunteered with a nonprofit organization that provided legal services to abuse victims. When I called their hotline explaining my situation, Jessica agreed to meet with me for a free consultation. She immediately recognized that my case involved several potential crimes including identity theft, fraud, and possibly elder abuse if my grandparents' estate had been mishandled. Jessica's initial review of the evidence Jake had gathered revealed something we'd missed in our earlier investigation. The LLC formation documents showed that my parents had forged my signature on several legal papers, including a document where I supposedly waived any claim to inherit the family home. This forgery was a felony that could result in serious criminal charges, and it gave us leverage we hadn't known we possessed. More importantly, Jessica believed that my case was strong enough to pursue on a contingency basis, meaning I wouldn't have to pay her fees unless we won. With Jessica's legal expertise supporting Jake's investigative work, I finally felt like I had a real chance to fight back against my family's coordinated attack on my life. We began developing a comprehensive strategy that would not only expose their fraudulent scheme, but also seek financial compensation for the damages they'd caused me. For the first time in months, I started to believe that justice might actually be possible. Jessica Torres's investigation into my family's financial crimes uncovered layers of deception that went far deeper than I'd imagined. Working with a forensic accountant she knew from previous cases, Jessica traced financial transactions going back 3 years and discovered a systematic pattern of identity theft and document forgery that had been targeting me long before I moved back home. My parents hadn't just decided to betray me during my time of need. They'd been planning to steal my inheritance and destroy my future for years. The most shocking discovery came when Jessica obtained copies of my grandparents' original estate documents. My maternal grandparents had died when I was in college, and I'd been told at the time that they'd left everything to my parents with the understanding that the wealth would eventually be passed down to their grandchildren. But the actual will told a completely different story. My grandparents had specifically bequeathed the family home to me, along with a substantial cash inheritance that should have been held in trust until my 30th birthday. According to the forensic accountant's analysis, this inheritance was worth approximately $600,000 when my grandparents passed away, and would have grown to well over $800,000 by now with proper investment. My parents had stolen this entire inheritance by producing a fake will that left everything to them, and they'd been living off my grandparents' money, while charging me rent to live in what was legally my own house. The scope of their theft was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty. Jessica also discovered that my parents had been using my social security number to open credit accounts and take out loans without my knowledge. Over the past 5 years, they'd opened 3 credit cards in my name, taken out a personal loan for $25,000, and even applied for a home equity line of credit using my identity as a co-borrower. All of these accounts had been managed carefully enough to avoid defaulting, which explained why I'd never received collection calls or notices, but the debt existed and was legally my responsibility. But the most damaging identity theft was related to the inheritance fraud. My parents had forged my signature on numerous legal documents over the years, including papers that supposedly showed me voluntarily waiving my rights to my grandparents' estate. They'd created a false paper trail suggesting that I'd been consulted about all major financial decisions, and had agreed to let them manage the inherited assets on my behalf. These forged documents were what allowed them to maintain control of property that legally belonged to me. The discovery of this massive fraud gave me the leverage I needed to make the phone call that would change everything. With Jessica's guidance, I contacted Bank of America, which held the mortgage on our family home, and informed them that I was the rightful owner of the property, and had never consented to any loans being taken against it. I explained that my parents had used forged documents to secure credit using property that didn't legally belong to them, making their $300,000 home equity loan fraudulent from the beginning. The bank's fraud investigation department took my claims seriously enough to freeze all accounts related to the property pending a full review of the documentation. Within 24 hours, my parents received notice that their home equity line of credit was under investigation, and that they would need to provide additional verification of their ownership rights before accessing any remaining credit. This development sent shockwaves through their carefully planned financial scheme. But my family's response to this disruption was to escalate their attacks against me to a level of viciousness I hadn't thought possible from people who'd once claimed to love me. Dad hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit claiming that I was attempting to extort money from the family through false accusations and fraudulent inheritance claims. The lawsuit sought damages for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and asked for a restraining order that would prevent me from contacting anyone in my family or discussing our disputes with third parties. Marcus took an even more aggressive approach by hiring what appeared to be private security or potentially criminal associates to intimidate me. These men began following me when I left Maria's house, parking outside businesses where I went for job interviews, and generally making their presence known in ways that felt threatening but weren't quite illegal. One evening, I returned to my car after a job interview to find that someone had keyed deep scratches along both sides and left a note on my windshield that said, "Drop it or else." The psychological warfare reached its peak when Sandra called me from a blocked number and left a voicemail that was filled with more hatred than I'd known any human being was capable of expressing. She told me that I was dead to her, regardless of how this legal battle turned out, and that even if I somehow managed to take their house and money, I would never have a family again, because they would make sure that everyone who knew me understood what a vindictive and evil person I really was. She ended the message by saying that if I died tomorrow, she wouldn't even attend my funeral. This level of cruelty from my own mother pushed me into a psychological crisis that required professional intervention. I started having panic attacks that left me unable to breathe, nightmares that made sleep almost impossible, and periods of dissociation where I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart rather than experiencing my own trauma. Maria insisted that I see a therapist, and she drove me to appointments when I was too anxious to drive myself. The breaking point came when I received a text message that included photos of me taken with a telephoto lens while I was visiting Jessica's office. Someone had been surveilling me closely enough to document my meetings with my attorney, and they were letting me know that my supposedly confidential legal strategy was being monitored. The message included no words, just the photos and a single emoji of a knife, making the threat of violence crystal clear. That night, I was hospitalized for severe anxiety and exhaustion after Maria found me hyperventilating in her guest room and unable to speak coherently. During my 24-hour stay in the psychiatric unit, I seriously considered abandoning my legal fight and accepting whatever financial settlement my parents might offer in exchange for dropping all charges and disappearing from their lives forever. The cost of fighting them was destroying my mental health and potentially putting my physical safety at risk. But while I was in the hospital, Jessica made a discovery that changed everything. She'd been investigating the financial history of Martinez Family Holdings LLC and discovered that my parents had been planning this fraud for much longer than we'd realized. They'd incorporated the company 18 months before I moved back home, suggesting that they'd been preparing to steal my inheritance regardless of whether I ever needed their help. My unemployment and heartbreak had simply provided them with the perfect opportunity to execute a plan they'd been developing for years. This revelation convinced me that retreat was impossible, because my parents would never stop trying to destroy me as long as they thought I might expose their crimes. They'd already stolen my inheritance, ruined my credit, destroyed my relationships with extended family, and attempted to have me arrested on false charges. If I walked away now, they would consider themselves immune from consequences and would likely target me again in the future. My only choice was to fight back with everything I had and expose the truth about what they'd done. My time in the psychiatric unit, though traumatic, gave me the clarity I needed to understand that I was fighting for more than just money or property. This was a battle for my right to exist as a person deserving of basic human dignity and respect. My parents had declared war on my very identity, and the only way to survive was to become as strategic and ruthless as they were. I decided that if they wanted to play dirty, I would learn their game and beat them at it. The first thing I did after being released from the hospital was to begin systematically documenting every aspect of their harassment and intimidation. I installed recording apps on my phone to capture any calls or voicemails they might leave, and I started carrying a small camera to photograph evidence of their surveillance and threats. Maria helped me set up additional security cameras around her property to record anyone who might be watching the house or attempting to intimidate us. Jessica taught me how to be my own investigator in ways that would be legally admissible in court. We developed a system for organizing evidence chronologically and categorically, creating detailed timelines that showed the escalation of my family's criminal behavior. I learned how to take screenshots with proper timestamps, how to preserve digital evidence without altering it, and how to document conversations in ways that would hold up under cross-examination. But my most valuable education came from learning to think like the criminals I was fighting against. I realized that my parents' greatest weakness was their arrogance and their assumption that I would eventually give up and disappear quietly. They'd gotten sloppy about covering their tracks because they believed I was too weak and isolated to pose a real threat to their plans. This overconfidence would ultimately be their downfall. Working with Jake Morrison, I began building a network of allies who had been damaged by my family's actions in various ways. We contacted the other creditors who'd been defrauded by my parents' identity theft schemes and found several companies that were willing to cooperate with our investigation. We also reached out to former business associates of Marcus who confirmed that he'd been involved in multiple fraudulent investment schemes over the years. The breakthrough in our investigation came when Jake managed to gain access to Marcus's email account through a security vulnerability at his workplace. The emails revealed that my brother had been the mastermind behind much of the family's criminal activity, and that he'd been pressuring our parents to accelerate their timeline for stealing my inheritance because he needed money to cover gambling debts that I hadn't known existed. Marcus's emails also revealed the existence of additional bank accounts and financial instruments that we hadn't discovered in our earlier investigation. He'd been using cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore banking services to hide money that had been stolen through various identity theft schemes, not just mine but also targeting several other family members and business contacts over the years. The scope of his criminal enterprise was far larger than we'd initially realized. Most importantly, we discovered communications between Marcus and the men who'd been following and threatening me. He'd hired them through a private security company that specialized in asset recovery and debt collection, services that were often used by criminals to intimidate victims without technically breaking laws against stalking or harassment. But some of their actions had crossed legal lines, and we now had evidence connecting Marcus directly to criminal conspiracy charges. The emails also revealed that my parents were planning to accelerate their timeline for selling the house and distributing the profits because they were becoming nervous about my legal challenge. They intended to liquidate all assets and transfer the money to offshore accounts within 60 days, which would make it virtually impossible for me to recover anything even if I won my court case. This discovery forced us to move quickly to freeze their assets before they could complete their escape plan. With Jessica's help, I filed emergency motions requesting immediate court orders to prevent my parents from selling any property or transferring any funds while our legal dispute was pending. We presented evidence of their flight risk and their history of financial fraud to convince the judge that immediate intervention was necessary to preserve the integrity of the legal process. The judge granted our request, effectively freezing all of my family's assets until the case could be resolved. The asset freeze sent my parents into a panic that revealed just how desperate their financial situation had become. Within hours of receiving notice from the court, Dad was calling me directly for the first time in months, begging me to be reasonable and work something out that didn't involve destroying the whole family. His sudden willingness to negotiate proved that their entire aggressive strategy had been based on the assumption that I would never be able to mount an effective legal challenge. But I was no longer the vulnerable and isolated person they thought they could intimidate into submission. I'd learned to be as calculating and strategic as they were, and I was surrounded by professionals who understood exactly how to dismantle their criminal enterprise. When Dad called asking for mercy, I told him that I would consider dropping all charges in exchange for full restitution of my stolen inheritance plus damages for their harassment and identity theft. I also demanded a written confession detailing all of their crimes, and an agreement to never contact me again. Dad's response to my demands revealed that he still didn't understand how completely his situation had changed. He accused me of being greedy and vindictive, and threatened to fight this to the bitter end, rather than admit to any wrongdoing. His refusal to accept responsibility or show remorse for the damage he'd caused convinced me that negotiation was pointless, and that total victory was the only acceptable outcome. Over the following weeks, I watched my family's criminal empire begin to collapse as law enforcement agencies started investigating the evidence we'd provided. The bank fraud investigation expanded into a full-scale federal case involving multiple agencies, and Marcus was arrested on charges related to his cryptocurrency schemes and his hiring of criminal associates to intimidate witnesses. The systematic destruction of their lives felt like justice finally being served. But the most satisfying moment came when I realized that I'd successfully turned their own tactics against them. They tried to isolate me and destroy my support network, so I'd built a better network of allies who were committed to exposing the truth. They tried to intimidate me into submission, so I'd learned to document their crimes and use their own evidence against them. They'd underestimated my intelligence and determination, and that mistake would cost them everything they'd worked to steal. With our evidence meticulously organized and our legal strategy perfected, Jessica and I filed a comprehensive lawsuit that would expose every aspect of my family's criminal enterprise. The complaint included charges of inheritance fraud, identity theft, forgery, criminal conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of my civil rights. We sought not only full restitution of my stolen inheritance, but also punitive damages that would ensure my family could never financially recover from their crimes. But I'd learned from my family's example that legal action alone wasn't enough to achieve true justice. They'd used social media and public humiliation as weapons against me, so I decided to turn those same weapons against them. I created a blog called Betrayed by Blood, where I published the entire story of their betrayal, complete with documentation and evidence that proved every accusation I made. The blog post went viral within days, reaching thousands of readers who shared similar experiences of family financial abuse. The power of social media exceeded even my expectations when I posted a video on TikTok with the hashtag #FamilyBetrayal that summarized my story in 3 minutes. The video received over 2 million views in the first week, with thousands of comments from viewers expressing outrage at my family's behavior and support for my legal fight. Many viewers shared their own stories of inheritance theft and family financial abuse, creating a community of survivors who validated each other's experiences. Local news outlets picked up the story after my social media posts gained national attention. I was interviewed by 3 different television stations and 2 newspapers, all of which presented my case as an example of elder abuse and inheritance fraud that highlighted the need for stronger legal protections for vulnerable family members. The media coverage put additional pressure on law enforcement agencies to pursue criminal charges against my parents and Marcus. My family's attempts to control the narrative backfired spectacularly when they hired a public relations firm to manage their response to the negative publicity. The PR firm advised them to present themselves as the victims of a vindictive daughter, who was mentally unstable, and seeking revenge for being asked to become financially independent. But this strategy only drew more attention to the evidence I'd published, and investigative journalists began independently verifying my claims and discovering additional evidence of their crimes. Robert hired an expensive criminal defense attorney who attempted to discredit me by claiming that I'd fabricated evidence and manipulated documents to support false accusations. But when Jessica presented the forensic accounting reports and the authentication of forged signatures to the court, it became clear that my family's denials were desperate lies designed to avoid accountability. The judge ruled that there was probable cause to believe that multiple felonies had been committed, and ordered a full criminal investigation. Marcus's legal situation deteriorated rapidly when additional victims of his cryptocurrency schemes came forward after seeing the media coverage of our case. The FBI discovered that he'd been running a Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors of over $800,000. Money that he'd lost through gambling addiction and poor financial decisions. His arrest on federal fraud charges meant that he was facing potential prison time that could extend for decades. The most dramatic moment in our legal battle came when Sandra attempted to testify on behalf of the family's innocence, but ended up providing evidence that supported my case instead. Under cross-examination by Jessica, Mom contradicted several key elements of their defense strategy, and admitted to facts that proved they'd been lying about their financial situation. Her testimony was so damaging to their case that their own attorney asked for a recess to consult with his clients about changing their plea. But my family's desperation led them to make increasingly reckless decisions that only strengthened my position. Dad attempted to flee the country with liquid assets hidden in offshore accounts, but airport security arrested him before his flight to Costa Rica could depart. His attempt to flee was treated as evidence of consciousness of guilt, and resulted in additional charges for attempting to obstruct justice and evade prosecution. The systematic collapse of their legal defense was accompanied by equally devastating personal consequences. Robert lost his job at the insurance company when his employer learned about the criminal charges and the negative publicity surrounding the case. Sandra was forced to close her accounting firm when clients canceled their contracts to avoid being associated with someone accused of financial fraud. Their professional reputations were destroyed permanently, making it unlikely that they'd ever be able to work in finance or insurance again. Sophia finally broke her silence and contacted me to confess her role in the conspiracy and offer to testify against our parents and Marcus in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She revealed additional details about the timeline of their planning and confirmed that the entire scheme had been designed to steal my inheritance regardless of whether I ever needed their help. Her cooperation provided the final pieces of evidence we needed to prove criminal intent and systematic fraud. The financial consequences for my family were even more severe than the legal ones. The court ordered the immediate liquidation of all assets acquired with stolen funds, including the house, Marcus's truck, Mom's jewelry collection, and Dad's investment accounts. The money from these sales would be used to provide restitution to all victims of their various fraud schemes, with my inheritance claim receiving priority as the largest single theft they'd committed. Watching my family's empire of lies and theft collapse completely was more satisfying than I'd anticipated, But it also came with complicated emotions that I hadn't expected. These were people I'd loved for most of my life. And seeing them face the consequences of their choices felt like a form of grief, even though they'd brought their destruction entirely upon themselves. I realized that achieving justice doesn't always provide the emotional closure that victims hope for, but it does ensure that criminals can't continue hurting innocent people. The final court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 11 months after I'd first discovered that my family was planning to evict me from what I thought was their house. Jessica and I arrived at the courthouse confident that we had overwhelming evidence of my family's guilt, but I was still nervous about whether the judge would impose sentences that truly reflected the severity of their crimes. The possibility that they might receive only minor punishments after destroying my life so completely was terrifying. Judge Patricia Hendricks had reviewed all evidence in advance and was clearly prepared to deliver comprehensive justice. She began the hearing by stating that inheritance fraud and identity theft were serious felonies that undermined the basic trust that made family relationships and financial institutions possible. She noted that my family's crimes were particularly egregious because they'd targeted a vulnerable family member during a time of personal crisis and had shown no remorse for the damage they'd caused. The judge's ruling exceeded my most optimistic expectations. She ordered full restitution of my $800,000 inheritance plus accrued interest, bringing the total to over $950,000. She also awarded me $450,000 in punitive damages for the emotional distress and reputational harm caused by their harassment and defamation. The total judgment of nearly $1.4 million would be satisfied through the liquidation of all family assets and garnishment of their future earnings. Robert was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for bank fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The judge noted that his role as the family patriarch made him ultimately responsible for orchestrating the criminal enterprise, and that his attempt to flee the country demonstrated his lack of remorse and continued danger to society. Sandra received 18 months in minimum security prison for her participation in the fraud, with an additional 2 years of supervised probation. Marcus faced the harshest punishment because his criminal activities extended far beyond the family conspiracy. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for running the cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme, plus additional time for witness intimidation and conspiracy charges related to hiring criminals to threaten me. The judge stated that his predatory behavior toward multiple victims showed a pattern of sociopathic conduct that required extended incarceration to protect the public. Sophia's cooperation with our investigation earned her immunity from prosecution, but she still faced devastating personal consequences. The publicity surrounding the case destroyed her reputation in the marketing industry, and she was forced to resign from her job when clients refused to work with someone associated with such a notorious fraud case. She moved to Portland and changed her name in an attempt to start over with a completely new identity. The financial destruction of my family was even more complete than their legal punishment. The forced sale of their house, vehicles, investments, and personal property generated enough money to pay my full judgment with additional funds left over for the other victims of Marcus's various schemes. They were left with no assets other than basic personal belongings, and faced decades of garnished wages to pay off remaining debts and legal fees. But the most profound consequence was the complete disintegration of relationships with extended family and friends. Relatives who had initially supported my parents' version of events turned against them once the evidence of their guilt became public. Family members began sharing stories of suspicious financial requests and manipulative behavior that they'd overlooked or forgiven in the past, creating a pattern that revealed decades of unethical conduct. Robert and Sandra's marriage, which had lasted 32 years, ended in a bitter divorce as each blamed the other for their catastrophic downfall. Dad claimed that the entire scheme had been Mom's idea, and that he'd only participated to keep the family together. Mom accused Dad of pressuring her into criminal activity to cover Marcus's gambling debts and poor financial decisions. Their mutual recriminations provided additional evidence for prosecutors and ensured that neither could rehabilitate their reputation by claiming to be a victim of the other's manipulation. The media coverage of our case had lasting effects that extended far beyond my family's personal destruction. My story became a catalyst for legislative discussions about strengthening legal protections against inheritance fraud and identity theft within families. Several states introduced bills that would require additional verification procedures for estate transfers and create stronger penalties for financial crimes committed against family members. For me personally, winning the case provided financial security that I'd never expected to have, but it came at the cost of losing my entire biological family permanently. The money allowed me to start my own cybersecurity consulting firm and purchase a beautiful condominium in San Francisco, but I still struggled with complex feelings of grief and guilt about the role I'd played in destroying the people who'd raised me, even though they'd thoroughly deserved their punishment. The therapeutic process of recovering from family trauma was more difficult than I'd anticipated, requiring years of counseling to process the betrayal and develop the ability to trust new relationships. I learned that victims of family financial abuse often struggle with shame and self-blame, even when they've been clearly wronged, and that healing requires accepting that some people are fundamentally selfish and manipulative regardless of their biological connections to their victims. But I also discovered that surviving such extreme betrayal had made me stronger and more resilient than I'd ever been before. I developed a deeper appreciation for genuine friendship and authentic relationships, and I became passionate about helping other victims of family financial abuse navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives. My experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for toxic family members is to hold them accountable for their actions, even when doing so destroys the relationship permanently. The complete victory I achieved through the legal system provided closure and validation that helped me understand that I'd never been the problem in my family dynamics. My parents and Marcus had always been willing to sacrifice other people's well-being for their own financial gain, and my vulnerability during a difficult period in my life had simply provided them with the opportunity to reveal their true character. Recognizing this truth was painful, but ultimately liberating because it freed me from any obligation to maintain relationships with people who'd proven themselves to be fundamentally untrustworthy. 18 months have passed since the final court hearing that ended the legal battle with my biological family, and I'm writing this from my home office in my San Francisco condominium, where I've built a life that's more authentic and fulfilling than anything I could have imagined during the darkest days of that nightmare. My cybersecurity consulting firm now employs 12 people and has contracts with several major tech companies, work that feels meaningful because it helps protect other people from the kind of digital fraud and identity theft that nearly destroyed my life. The financial settlement allowed me to create the stability I'd been seeking when I first moved back to my parents' house, but more importantly, it gave me the resources to help other people who are facing similar battles against predatory family members. I've become a volunteer advocate for inheritance fraud victims, working with nonprofit organizations to provide support and legal referrals for people who are being financially abused by relatives they trusted. This work has shown me that my experience, while extreme, was unfortunately not unique in a society where elder abuse and family financial crimes are becoming increasingly common. 6 months ago, I received an unexpected email from Sophia, who had been living in Portland under her new legal name. Her message was a genuine apology that acknowledged the full scope of damage caused by her participation in our parents' scheme, and accepted responsibility for choosing money over family loyalty when I needed support most. She explained that therapy had helped her understand how her childhood in our dysfunctional family had normalized manipulative and selfish behavior, but she wasn't seeking forgiveness or trying to rebuild our relationship. I chose to respond to Sophia's apology because I recognized that she'd been genuinely manipulated by Marcus and our parents, even though she was legally an adult capable of making her own decisions. Our correspondence has been limited to occasional updates about our separate lives, and we've agreed that we're too psychologically damaged by our shared trauma to attempt rebuilding a sisterly relationship. But knowing that she understands the truth about what happened and feels genuine remorse has provided some emotional closure that I didn't realize I needed. Robert sent me a handwritten letter from prison last year asking for forgiveness and claiming that he'd only participated in the fraud scheme to protect the family from Marcus's gambling debts. His letter included no genuine accountability for his choices and seemed designed primarily to seek pity rather than make amends for the damage he'd caused. I chose not to respond because engaging with his manipulation would only provide him with the attention and validation he was seeking. Some relationships are so poisoned by betrayal that they can never be repaired, regardless of apologies or expressions of regret. The most unexpected development in my healing process has been my relationship with David Kim, a software engineer I met at a professional networking event 8 months ago. Dating again after experiencing such profound betrayal required me to develop new approaches to trust and vulnerability, and David's patience with my emotional walls and triggers has been extraordinary. He understands that my family trauma affects how I process conflict and intimacy, and he's committed to building a relationship based on transparency and mutual respect rather than the manipulation and hidden agendas that characterize my biological family. Maria Gonzalez, who saved my life by offering shelter and support when I was homeless and desperate, has become the closest thing to a mother figure I'll ever have again. We have dinner together every Sunday, and she's taught me how to cook traditional Mexican dishes while sharing stories about building a life in America after immigrating from El Salvador. Her unconditional love and support have shown me what healthy family relationships actually look like, and her guest room will always be my backup home if life ever becomes overwhelming again. Jessica Torres remains both my attorney and my friend, and we're collaborating on a book about family financial abuse that will help other victims understand their legal rights and develop strategies for protecting themselves from predatory relatives. The book will include practical information about recognizing warning signs of inheritance fraud, documenting evidence of financial crimes, and navigating the legal system as a victim rather than remaining silent about family dysfunction that enables ongoing abuse. The therapeutic work I've done to process this trauma has taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending that toxic family members deserve forgiveness they haven't earned. Instead, healing means accepting that some people will always choose their own interests over the well-being of others, and that protecting yourself from such people is an act of self-love rather than selfishness. I've learned to trust my instincts about manipulative behavior, and to prioritize my own safety and happiness over maintaining relationships with people who've proven themselves to be harmful. My experience has also shown me that family is ultimately about choice rather than biology, and that the people who support you during your darkest moments are your real family regardless of whether you share DNA. Maria, Jessica, David, and several close friends have created a chosen family that provides more love, loyalty, and emotional security than my biological relatives ever offered. These relationships are based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation or financial convenience. The most important lesson I've learned is that speaking truth about family dysfunction is not betrayal, even when that truth destroys relationships or exposes criminal behavior. Remaining silent about abuse enables abusers to continue harming vulnerable people, and protecting toxic family members from consequences only encourages them to escalate their harmful behavior. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to hold them accountable for their actions, even when doing so ends the relationship permanently. If you're currently dealing with financial abuse or manipulation from family members, please know that you're not alone, and that seeking help is not disloyal or ungrateful. Trust your instincts about behavior that feels wrong or exploitative, document everything that seems suspicious, and don't hesitate to contact law enforcement or seek legal advice if you suspect criminal activity. Your safety and well-being matter more than maintaining family relationships that are based on deception and exploitation. I want to hear about your experiences with family dynamics and financial relationships in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that relatives were hiding important information about money or inheritance? How did you handle situations where family members pressured you financially? What advice would you give to someone who suspects they're being manipulated or deceived by people they trusted? Your stories and insights could help other viewers who might be facing similar challenges. Please hit the like button if this story resonated with you, or if you think it might help someone else who's dealing with difficult family situations. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about overcoming betrayal and building authentic relationships. Share this video with friends or family members who might benefit from hearing about the importance of setting boundaries with toxic relatives. And remember that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from people who don't value your well-being, even when those people are supposed to love you unconditionally. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting survivors of family abuse with your engagement and comments. I hope that sharing my experience helps you feel less alone if you're facing similar challenges, and that it reminds you that you deserve relationships built on honesty, respect, and genuine care. Until next time, remember that your chosen family can be more valuable than your biological one, and that protecting yourself from harmful people is always the right choice.